Today we're going to go through the best settings for the MSI MPG 341CQR X36. This is their new 34-inch ultra-wide 360Hz OLED monitor. We'll set the screen up in both SDR and HDR usage and look at other settings like gaming features and OLED care. But let's start with SDR. We've got the screen at its default settings to start with, and you can see that in this section the default preset mode is set to Eco. We're actually going to move out of that, and we're going to use the user preset mode where we're going to have full access to adjust all of the different settings and set this up how we like it for SDR. So you'll see that HDR is turned off at the moment. We've left that disabled in Windows, and we're going to set the screen up in a couple of different modes here depending on how you want to use the screen. So first of all, we'll set the screen up in its native wide gamut mode, its full native color space, and that will give you more saturated and vivid colors for gaming, multimedia and other usage. We find that a lot of people prefer that more colorful looking image. In this menu, we're going to adjust the brightness setting. Now you can set this to whatever you find comfortable for your ambient light conditions and your user preferences. You can really set it at whatever, but if you want to target a specific common luminance value, then you can use a setting of 28 for 120 nits, 37 for 150 nits, or 53 will get you to 200 nits. Those are just common targets. Again, set this at whatever you like. We'll set this at 200 for argument's sake. And contrast can stay at its default 70, sharpness at 0, no need to turn on image enhancement. Color temperature, we're going to move out of the default 6500K mode and we're going to use the customize mode, where you then have access just to tweak the RGB values. We're going to use a setting of 98 for red, 98 for green, and leave blue on 100. We found that just gave a slightly better balance of the RGB channels and delivered us a white point close to the 6500K target. So we'll leave that on customize. Low blue light, we'll leave this turned off. If you want to have a warmer setup and perhaps a more comfortable setup for evening usage, lots of text work, you could just turn this on, but we'd recommend leaving it off for the most accurate setup. Saturation can stay on 50, no need to change 6-axis color, and gamma can stay on its default 2.2. So in this mode, the screen's using its full native color space. If you've used those settings and you want to try out our calibrated ICC profile, we'll link to that in the description below, and you can use that to clamp back to the sRGB color space for color aware applications. So that's available when paired with the user mode. The other options that you might want to consider exploring would be to use the defined sRGB color space mode. That's the emulation mode for sRGB, perhaps the Adobe RGB mode or the DCI-P3 mode. Now you could use any of those modes if you want to work very specifically with those color spaces for content creation, or if you prefer a less saturated image for standard sRGB and SDR content. So the sRGB mode is pretty good for clamping back to the sRGB color space. You can use the same brightness settings that we went through before. As a reminder, 28 was 120 nits, 37 for 150 nits, or 53 for 200 nits, but set that at whatever you find comfortable. Color temperature, you don't actually have access to use the customize mode in the sRGB preset, so we're going to leave that on 6500 Kelvin. That's the closest to the target anyway. And gamma we'll leave on 2.2, but if you want to experiment and use any other gamma for specific content, then you can change that here in any of the modes, but we're going to leave that on 2.2. Same thing goes for Adobe RGB. That will just clamp back to the Adobe RGB color space, potentially if you're working with photography applications and that kind of thing. DCI-P3 will clamp back to that color space for potentially things like HDR content creation. But we think most people will either want to use the sRGB emulation mode or the user mode, and potentially compare the user mode with our calibrated ICC profile so that you can use the best of both worlds in certain applications. In the gaming menu, you can turn on any of these other features that you want to play with for different gaming situations. It's probably best just to experiment with those, see which ones you like. AI vision might be useful for enhancing the near black shadow detail in some darker gaming situations, so experiment with that and see if that helps at all. You can also turn on the AI care sensor in this menu. You'll see it's off by default, but if you turn that on, you can then set that to either the system mode where you control it via Windows or the monitor mode. Now for argument's sake, we'll set it to the monitor mode because then you've got the options for wake on approach, where you can set the timer delay, lock on leave, again you can set the delay, and you can set things like the adaptive dim function, which will auto dim the screen as you look away from it. So if you want to use the AI care sensor, you can turn that on here. Likewise with the AI brightness, that's the ambient light sensor, which will automatically and dynamically control your screen brightness depending on your ambient light conditions. You can turn that on here as well if you want, or you can use some of the customized settings. So just turn those on if you want to use either of those features. In this menu, you can leave adaptive sync turned on as long as you want to use variable refresh rates for gaming. And that's everything you probably want to change in that section. In the OLED care menu, you want to leave as many of these features turned on as you can to help with the mitigation of image retention. Pixel shift you can't actually turn off, but if you find it noticeable or problematic, you could always turn it down to slow here. And then the other settings should all be on by default, but just check. If you find any of them cause issues or weird dimming behavior or are distracting during your usage, you could come in here and turn some of those off, but we think it's best to leave as many of them turned on as you can. In this last menu, you can turn on or off the power LED, which is just on the bottom of the chin. It's not exactly very noticeable, so you probably won't need to turn that off for most people. You can turn the RGB lighting off on the back of the screen if you want. You might also want to enable the HDMI CEC feature. That will mean that when you power on an external HDMI device, like maybe a games console, the screen will auto switch over to that input for you. That's quite a handy function. And then you can also set any shortcuts that you want here from the Navi key. If you want quick access to maybe the brightness or the input source or whatever, you can set those there to your liking. We've now enabled Windows HDR. You'll see the screen automatically switches over to the HDR mode. As a reminder, we'd recommend only enabling Windows HDR when you're going to view actual HDR content, otherwise leave it disabled. You'll see that some of the settings are now grayed out when you're in HDR mode. Some of the preset modes are still available, but a lot of the settings within them are now grayed out and unavailable. We're going to leave it in the user mode. That will give you the full native color space. And the only setting really that you want to change is in this menu. You'll see the display HDR setting. Now you've got a few different options to choose from here. The default is True Black 500. We think that most people will find that the EOTF boost mode gives the best balance between reaching the highest peak brightness, the same as the peak 1300 mode, but without the excessive dimming that you get in that mode, and will look overall very similar in brightness in those kind of brighter scenes as the True Black 500 mode. So we think that's probably the best balance between the two different modes. So we'd recommend just switching over to the EOTF boost mode, but by all means try some of the other modes if you want to. Leave HDR brightness set on its maximum 100 unless for some reason you find particular use cases very bright, but that will give you the maximum peak brightness in HDR. And that's all there really is to change in the HDR mode, and there's the screen set up therefore for both SDR and HDR usage. If you found this video useful, just give us a quick like below, that would be appreciated, and you'll find a link to our full review and the calibrated ICC profile in the description below as well. Thank you for watching, we'll catch you next time.